The program will begin momentarily. Good afternoon. My name is Max Latona, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Ethics and Society at St. Anselm College. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's program entitled Schools, Funding, and Choice, Solutions to Inequities in New Hampshire Schools. We have a distinguished group of panelists today, as well as an exceptional moderator, all of whom will be introduced to you in a moment. Before we do so, I'd like to say a few very brief words about our center and our Ethics and Policy Initiative, especially to those of you who are hearing about us for the first time. Our mission at the Center for Ethics and Society is to address important ethical challenges in our world, and to do so through collaborative research, education, and discussion. Dialogue and collaboration are essential to who we are at the center, in part because we think this is the most effective way for organizations and communities to get results, but also because we think that listening to and learning from one another are truly some of the most ethical things that we can do. Today's program takes place as part of the Center's Ethics and Policy Initiative, the main purpose of which is to bring attention to policy problems in New Hampshire's communities and to discuss possible solutions. Constructing good policies or deconstructing bad ones are essential to the vitality, health, and prosperity of our communities here in New Hampshire. Our topic today, which is really about achieving fairness in K through 12 education, follows up upon a program we held earlier this year in which we explored how restrictive zoning in New Hampshire's communities has resulted in disparities of educational opportunity for our children. To put it bluntly, we have schools in wealthy communities that are well-resourced, providing top-flight educations, and we have schools in poorer communities struggling to meet the needs of their teachers and students. Today, we are confronting this question head-on. How should we address the fact that many of New Hampshire's children simply lack access to the same high-quality educational opportunities that other New Hampshire children enjoy? In regards to the format for today's program, here is what you can expect. After our moderator introduces the panelists and the topic, you'll hear from each of them for no more than 5 minutes each, or thereabouts, after which there will be a 20 to 30-minute moderated panel discussion, and then an open question and answer session. Audience members are welcome and encouraged to pose a question at any point during the event, and we'll try to get to as many as we can during the last segment of the discussion. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window for your questions. So unless we run out of things to talk about, we'll wrap up the program exactly at 5:30 p.m. Okay, in accordance with New Hampshire state law, I am obligated to inform you that we are recording this session. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, who really needs no introduction to many New Hampshire residents. She is Laura Knoy. Laura Knoy is the founding host of NHPR's The Exchange, New Hampshire's only statewide call-in program, now in its 26th year, I believe. Laura is well known in New Hampshire for her in-depth coverage of important issues and is widely regarded for her interviews with presidential hopefuls. Laura is a graduate of Keene High School in New Hampshire. Prior to hosting The Exchange, Laura worked in public radio in Washington, D.C. as a local reporter and an announcer for WAMU and as a newscaster for NPR. Laura, thank you for joining us today as our moderator. I now turn the program over to you.
Oh, Max, thank you for inviting me today. It is great to be with everyone. You know, it's often said that education is the foundation of our democracy, and yet American society has long argued over the best way to deliver that education. who should pay for it, how much it should cost. Here in New Hampshire, as many of you know, the state has been engaged in a long debate over education funding, dating back to the original Claremont lawsuits almost 30 years ago. That debate continues today in our legislature with this year's discussions about education freedom accounts, which opponents call vouchers, and also the current lawsuits and legislative proposals concerning our local education funding systems. So with this in mind, the question we're asking today is, what are the best ways to address inequities in educational opportunity in K through 12? We'll ask our guests to give their views on that. And then, as Max said, we'll open it up to a wider discussion. So in the spirit of openness to hearing all ideas and even of finding some common ground, we invite you to our event today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guests. First, we have Dianna Terrell. Her research interests include education policy, the impact of high-stakes tests on curriculum, instruction, and assessment, civic, democratic, and socially just education, teacher education, and the social and political context of education. She teaches curriculum and assessment, getting schooled, and supervises teacher interns and the sophomore early field experience. Professor Terrell is the chair of the education department at St. Anselm College and has previously served as chair of the New Hampshire Professional Standards Board, an advisory body to the New Hampshire Board of Education, and the faculty liaison for St. Anselm College's local chapter of Kappa Delta Pi, the International Honor Society in Education. A big welcome, Dianna. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks for having me.
Also with us, Corinne Cascadden. She was the superintendent of Berlin Public Schools from 2009 to 2019 and was a member of the New Hampshire School Funding Commission, whose final report was just released on December 1st, 2020. Currently serving on the Board of Trustees for North Country Healthcare, Corinne received her bachelor's and master's degrees from Plymouth State College, a certificate of advanced graduate study from the University of New Hampshire, and her doctoral degree in educational leadership from Nova Southeastern University. She has experience teaching in both private and public schools and recently served as interim superintendent of Littleton Public Schools. And Corinne, it's really nice to have you on the panel today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Tim DeRoche. He is the author of A Fine Line, How Most American Kids Are Kept Out of the Best Public Schools, which traces modern-day public school attendance zones back to the racist redlining practices of the early 20th century. Having started his career at the global strategic management company, McKinsey & Company, he's an experienced executive and consultant who served billion-dollar companies, leading foundations, and some of the most innovative nonprofits in K-12 education. He's written on education policy for Education Next, The Washington Post, Education Week, School Administrator, the Los Angeles Business Journal, and Quillette. And Tim, a big thank you for your time and for being with us today. And last but not certainly least, Corey DeAngelis. He's the National Director of Research at the American Federation for Children, the Executive Director at the Educational Freedom Institute, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and a senior fellow at the Reason Foundation. He was named on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for his work on education policy and received the Buckley Award from America's Future in 2020. Corey's research focuses on the effects of school choice programs on non-academic outcomes such as criminal activity, character skills, mental health, and political participation. And Corey, a big welcome to you too. Thank you so much for being here. And so let's begin now in that order that I just laid out with your broad thoughts on this question that we are posing to ourselves and to everyone today. What are the best ways to address inequities in educational opportunity in K through 12? And we're inviting all of you to take about, give or take, 5 minutes with this question. Dianna, kick it off for us, please, and thank you.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Laura. And I'm actually just setting my timer so I don't lose track of time. So I want to begin by highlighting something that you've just alluded to, which is that we're all here today because we hold in common this concern about the quality of public schools. And I think it's safe to say that nationwide, Americans are really becoming increasingly concerned about this. So I'd like to begin with just a little bit of a thought experiment since we're all here with the same concerns. I'd like everyone to try to think of a time perhaps quite early in your life, or maybe more recently, when you realize that other children who are about your age or your kids' age were attending a very different quality of school. So you might have noticed this on a field trip, or with your school band, or with a school sports team, or you might have moved. I'd like you to try to bring to mind a really concrete image of that school. What was so different from that school, between your school and that school? And what types of feelings did that raise in you about equality and about schooling in the United States? Now, I bring this up because this is my origin story of a sort. When I was 8, I moved from one district to another in Massachusetts. My parents said that we were moving because they had better schools. Now, these schools were only 20 miles apart from one another, but my siblings and I can all attest to the fact that all 4 of us were at least a grade behind our peers. We were also very unlike the kids from the new town in terms of how we passed our time and the ways in which our parents were involved in our education. So another thing that set this town apart was that it participated in the Metco program. So this was a voluntary school racial desegregation program that bused children from Boston into the burbs where we were. And I'll never forget seeing those children get off the bus so early in the morning, knowing that their commute was at least an hour and 15 minutes. And that was once all of the children were actually on the bus. So now, as a parent, I think back on those children and I wonder what it must have been like, what it must have taken for those parents to put their 6-year-olds and their 7-year-olds on a bus to travel every day so far away from them. So, like my own parents, those are parents that just wanted the best public school experience for their children, right? That makes sense. Okay. So I don't think that I have to really describe for anyone who's attending this webinar the features of schooling that are really big sources of inequality. You'll hear a lot today probably about from the panelists about school funding, which is a real massive source of inequality, but that's not the only one. There's a lot of other things that lead to the opportunity gap, to the achievement gap, which is the gap in average performance between middle and upper class children, predominantly white children, and working class and poor children, in many cases, children of color on the other hand. So this opportunity and achievement gap in the United States and here in New Hampshire is very, very well documented. But the question is, what can we do about it? Now, I think that this is where I can offer a bit of a unique perspective. When it comes to public schooling, New Hampshire is very privileged in so many ways. So according to Ed Week Quality Counts report in 2021, New Hampshire was the highest rated state in terms of parental education, the highest rated state in terms of parental income, and a top performing state in all metrics of academic outcomes in literacy and in numeracy. But despite all of this privilege, we're still experiencing massive inequality and access to healthy, quality public schooling. And I find this unconscionable, really. So I believe that this can be overcome by more state investment in public school systems, state investment and access to early childhood public education, public summer programming for our kids, state investment in quality teaching, and rigorous high impact curriculum and teaching. So of course, here's the thing, it's not cheap, New Hampshire. Some of the highest need children are some of the most expensive children to educate. In many cases, those aren't your kids or my kids. But if I'm not going to ship my children off on a bus for an hour ride to another community to be schooled, I don't think any other Granite State parent should have to do that either. So, and just wrapping up here, some of my thoughts, I'm going to quote from my scholastic hero, Bob Putnam. All of New Hampshire's children are our children. They're our kids, and our kids deserve high quality public schools in their own neighborhood. So thanks for having me here, Center for Ethics and Society, Max, Laura. I'm really looking forward to hearing what other panelists have to say.
Wow, Diana, it's really powerful to hear your personal story. Thank you for sharing that. And Corinne, could you go ahead, please? Your thoughts on this weighty question that we're looking at.
Sure. Thank you for having me. This is such a great opportunity and a venue to continue the discussion about the widening gap among school districts, particularly based on the current school funding formula in New Hampshire. So my perspective is as a practitioner. So I can give you some specific examples. I've developed many school budgets as a teacher, principal, superintendent, and state aid to public education continues to decrease and local property taxes continue to rise. Some adjustments as a result of that lack of state aid include reorganization of grade levels, closing buildings, reading and math interventions in hallways and closets, a decrease in administrative support, eliminating advanced placement classes, course electives, cut teaching and specialist positions, and further decreases in state funding for vocational tuition and transportation, which is with the Korean Technical Ed Centers, special education categorical aid, building aid, state contributions to New Hampshire retirement system. While New Hampshire legislators added state-mandated curriculums in civics, drug and alcohol education, health education, the cost of special ed services for students in charter schools, attainment of math competencies, annual air quality testing, data secure plans, and lead testing with no additional dollars. These are all great additions to school programs, but they certainly compromised local school budgets. In addition, there were delayed replacements of life safety equipment and modifications for secure entrances. Certainly student activities and related expenses were eliminated, suppressed the growth of CTE, Korean Technical Ed programs, testing and programs for English speakers of other languages. While schools with greater resources can certainly have all of those things, with more in terms of internships and apprenticeships, I like to use the analogy that some schools lime and mow their sports playing fields, while others can talk about installing artificial turf and have new and renovated buildings to talk about. So schools in New Hampshire have adapted and decreased costs based on enrollment trends, but the current status is the loss of state aid to education surpasses the decline in enrollments. Students who graduate with less opportunities and choices are not as competitive. There's a significant lack of comparable services. So better funded school districts, due to a greater capacity to raise more local property tax revenue, graduate a more prepared student. So what is the problem in New Hampshire? Well, from my perspective as a practitioner and experience in the field is one, is the inequity in student opportunities for all to achieve adequate outcomes. And two, the local property tax burden that is necessary to fund education in New Hampshire. I can tell you many New Hampshire districts are experiencing similar woes due to rising local property taxes and the decrease of state aid. Over many years, groups and organizations have attempted to gain statewide attention of the New Hampshire legislators. Examples are the School Funding Fairness Project, Reaching Higher New Hampshire. There were several local grassroots efforts for Save Our Schools or Solve Education funding with campaign buttons and banners and shirts. I know in 2018-19 era, many students attended and testified at legislative hearings because they noticed the inequities. There were petitions for change that circulated statewide as well. So the average cost to educate a student in New Hampshire is $17,000, but the New Hampshire State Adequacy provides a base cost of $3,700 per pupil. The inequities in student outcomes are really based on what town or city in New Hampshire can afford to pay in property taxes for the major portion of their school budgets. So the more local tax revenues or property wealth, the more districts can offer and provide. So there's a local mindset of my students versus a view for the education of all our students in New Hampshire. New Hampshire poor kids and poor districts have fewer resources, thus have poor outcomes. So moving forward, as you mentioned, Laura, on lawsuits, we have a history of school funding lawsuits that have made little progress in providing an equitable funding formula to meet the tenets for all students to achieve academic outcomes for an adequate education. Now, the courts have ruled on the constitutional requirement for a state-funded adequate education K-12. And as recent as June 2019, Judge David Roth ruled that it is a fundamental right for the opportunity to a fully state-funded adequate education. Now, to our credit, as Dianna mentioned, though she may have more current data than I have, I'm quoting 2019 data, New Hampshire ranked third in the nation for K-12 rankings and student performance by US News and World Reports and the National Assessment of Educational Progress, known as NAEP. However, the average outcomes, remember, fall between the well above average and the well below average performance. And then according to the Census Bureau, New Hampshire has the lowest amounts of state funding going to education in the nation. So using New Hampshire data, an AIR research brief, AIR being American Institute of Research, showed a strong correlation between a per pupil expenditures and student outcomes. And districts with low equalized property valuation per pupil have higher proportions of students with needs. So that would be poverty, special ed, English language learners. So in 2019, the New Hampshire legislature established a school funding commission to ensure and recommend to legislators a solution with a uniform and equitable design for financing K-12 public education systems as deemed in the New Hampshire Constitution, Part 2, Article 83. The commission was made up of 17 members. They included House representatives, state senators, public citizens. Now, I have to tell you, the commission worked very collaboratively and diligently from January to December of 2020. So the data is recent. The commission received a state budget of $500,000 and engaged support and guidance from the Carsey School of Public Policy at UNH, engaged the AIR, American Institutes on Research, for national data on school funding formulas, policy briefs, analysis, data reports of New Hampshire school districts. I mean, the commission did their homework. New Hampshire data was gleaned from the Department of Education and the Department of Revenue Administration and used to develop a model for a predicted cost to educate students from each district using an education cost model. The current school funding formula is a regressive model, and it's based on the cost to operate schools, whereas the commission recommends the education cost model based on a performance and predicted cost model. What does it cost for a student to receive an opportunity for an adequate education? So the commission worked as a whole and in 3 subgroups. And it was very complex. As you know, school funding is very complicated. But we focused on 3 groups: adequacy, fiscal policy, and public engagement. And I can tell you, around the state, there were very robust conversations with many stakeholder groups, from senior citizens, municipal and school leaders, legislators, taxpayer groups, students, and citizens. So the commission's final report includes many findings and recommendations, but the main recommendation is based on a simulator tool for a revised school funding formula for a predicted cost using an education cost model. So there are 2 options for legislators to consider for recommended action. One is to establish a minimum local contribution based on a uniform minimum local education tax rate, and the state funds the balance. Or 2, no local contributions, and the entire formula amount would be funded by state revenue sources. Now, the commission also stressed to the legislature that increased funding was very necessary for special education. As we know, nationally, it has not been funded even at the promised levels. Career and technical education, building aid, and early childhood are critical areas for successful development of the New Hampshire workforce, and economic development necessary to prevent the out-of-state migration that we hear people talk about. You know, the most complex and difficult move is that the current legislature, or the majority of the current legislature, is not focused on improving the education of all public school students, nor are they concerned about local property tax relief. The most intractable component is the political views that are a roadblock for significant improvements of a nonpartisan issue. The current legislative actions are indicative that public education systems will continue to be the haves and the have-nots based on a zip code. That, as the courts have ruled, is unconstitutional. So New Hampshire legislature must recognize that education for all students is the #1 investment for sustaining our vibrant and growing economy. And to achieve greater equity for students and taxpayers, it has to be our schools, all of our schools, and all of our kids. So I think that there is a solution, and I think the solution encompasses 3 points. The first being uphold the New Hampshire Constitution. The second, embrace and trust the work of the New Hampshire School Funding Commission by adopting and establishing one of the recommended options. And 3, act to provide a school funding formula for an opportunity for student outcomes and taxpayer fairness. And I think New Hampshire legislators can solve this issue. And I think they need to solve this issue for pre-K-12 public schools. And I feel they need to solve that problem before allocating or directing public funds from local property tax revenue for private or homeschool programs. And I'm not opposed to parents having choice.
Corinne, thank you, especially given your expertise in, balancing budgets. That's
It's a lot.
That's a hairy job. So I wouldn't wish it on anybody, and I really appreciate your expertise, and we'll probably hear more from you on, what that's like. I want to go to our next panelist. Tim, your take on this question that we are digging into today: how to address inequities in educational opportunity. Go ahead, Tim, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks for moderating. And I just want to say thanks to the Center for Ethics and Society, and thanks to Max for having me today. I have a couple personal connections to New Hampshire. A couple of my younger cousins have actually attended St. Anselm, and I've heard nothing but glowing things about the school. And then secondly, I've written a couple books, and there are more Tim DeRoche books per capita in New Hampshire than any other state. And I know that because my book distributor is in Keene. So there's a warehouse that holds a whole slew of my books. So really appreciate the opportunity to chat about this issue. I wrote my book based on my curiosity about some of the things that I was seeing in my neighborhood of Los Angeles. So in Los Angeles, what you see is people trying very hard to find the right school for their kid. Schools vary a tremendous amount in quality and in perceived quality. And how do you get your kid into a good school in Los Angeles? You make sure that you own a home or rent an apartment on the right side of a line drawn by the government, right? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this problem. This is an American thing. One of my curiosities was, does this happen all over the place? And what we found was that in the research for the book, I talked to parents and education experts and people who run schools across the country. And these lines matter so much in all sorts of, in all regions of the country, from the Northeast to the South, to the Southwest where I am, to the Northwest, to the Midwest where I grew up. These lines, and there are 2 types of lines. There are the school district lines. Those tend to get a fair bit of attention because they map to these funding inequities. But there's another type of line that is perhaps even more insidious, which is the intended zone, which is the zones drawn by the local district that say which kids get to go to which schools. So in many cases, you'll see families excluded from a school who live within walking distance of that school. And perhaps they are even taxpayers. Perhaps there are big capital improvements, renovations to this elite public school that is within walking distance of their home. And that family is paying taxes. They are paying for those renovations, and yet they are not allowed to attend. And so what you see here in LA is similar to what you see around the country, which is that there are sharp disparities in real estate prices across these lines, right? So you might pay for an equivalent home, you might pay $200,000 more, or even $300,000 more to be on one side of the line versus the other, because you are getting both a house and a free public, a quote unquote free public school. And these elite schools, often their attendance zones border schools that have been failing for decades, right? Or struggling for decades, despite huge increases in per pupil funding. And so my point about this, many people see this through the point of view, the lens of student performance, student achievement, or they see it through the lens of funding. And those are valid ways to look at it. I've come to look at this just through the lens of the social compact, right? What damage does it do to the social compact of our country when poor people live within walking distance of an elite public school with astounding levels of achievement, where everyone in the neighborhood wants to go? And when they walk their kid down there and they knock on the door and they say, hey, can I fill out an application? They're told, no, you are not allowed to go here. You don't live in the right zone. Somebody in the bowels of the school district drew a line and they decided that you can't come to this school. This privileges people with social capital and financial capital. When we allocate spaces in schools based on where people live, it basically allows, it gives a privileged position to those with wealth. And that undermines the very mission of public education. And so one of the key insights from my book was just the idea that we already have a name for this system where we decide who gets access to valuable government services based on where they live. And that name is redlining, right? So many of you are probably familiar with redlining. Redlining was something that happened during the New Deal era. There were a whole bunch of new government assistance programs for housing created. And the federal government, through an entity called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, drew maps. And these maps determined who was eligible for government assistance and who wasn't. And the areas that were shaded red and yellow were undesirable, and they were ineligible for this assistance. Who lived in those areas, right? Immigrants and people of color, right? Those maps were drawn to make sure that government assistance made it into the hands of politically powerful interest groups and voters. And we basically have the same system now. Nobody talks about it. We have a very, very similar system, right, for education, where we carve up the map and we tell people where they can go. And we say, these folks can go to this great school, but the other folks can't. And one of the things we did in the book is we took the old redlining maps and we took modern day attendance zones of these elite public schools and we overlaid them onto the redlining maps. And you can see that the same neighborhoods are being discriminated against. The same neighborhoods that have people of color and immigrants are being discriminated against in access to schools. I'm a young parent. I get a lot of pushback from families saying, well, we're just playing by the rules. We have to have a school near us. And I get it. I am not against proximity. One of the biggest priorities for me and my wife is to find a school near our home that's a good fit for our kids, right? Proximity matters tremendously. That is very different, right? Proximity matters for daycare, it matters for health clinics, it matters for work, it matters for many different things. It is a very different thing for the government to draw lines and to say these people get to go and these people don't. That is a very different thing than saying, that you want to find a school that is good for your kids near your home. Of course you do, and everyone should try to do that. It makes life much easier. But people should also be free to drive their kids across town. As Dianna said, right? If there are better schools and you want to put in that effort to get your kid there, or perhaps you work in a wealthy area and you want to take your kid and drop them off there, I think people should be allowed to do that. So anyway, I just want to come back to the social compact. I think these policies have been tremendously damaging to the social compact in this country. And I think it's one reason that so many on the right and the left have observed that where you live as a child is so predictive of your outcomes in this country at this point. And I think if we want that to change, I think we're going to have to take a hard look at these policies that assign kids to schools based on where they live.
Wow. Thank you, Tim. There's a lot there. And, we were all listening to your story about redlining and thinking, how can this still be? But you're pointing out that it is still going on. So I really appreciate that. And we'll dig into that for sure. Corey, last but not least, we'd love your thoughts too on this question. Again, what's the best way to address inequities in educational opportunity K through 12? So go ahead, Corey, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura, for hosting, and St. Anselm College for hosting as well. And thank you guys for also fellow participants for coming and sharing your thoughts. I think we can all agree that there are deep inequities that are entrenched in the current K through 12 public school system in the United States and in New Hampshire. But where I think some of us might differ is I don't think that throwing more money at a problem is going to fix it unless you can change the incentives that are baked into the system to be more responsive to families and to spend additional dollars wisely. In New Hampshire, for example, just go over data from the US Census Bureau from 2019, just came out last week. They spend $19,283 per student per year in total dollars. And this is 25% higher than the national average of about $15,600 per student. And over time, New Hampshire has increased its per pupil education expenditures in total by about 252% since 1970 after adjusting for inflation. So we throw more and more money at the problem year after year, and we expect different results without changing the incentives in the system. For where I differ is I think if you're going to throw more money at the problem, at least change the incentives in the system to make the schools more responsive to the needs of families. And the best way to do that is to fund the students directly so that schools have real incentives to cater to the needs of students and their families. Where did all that money go in New Hampshire? There's a report called Back to the Staffing Surge by Kennesaw State University's Ben Scafferty. He looked at the data between 1992 and 2014, which I'll share in a second. And he found that in New Hampshire, per pupil education expenditures after adjusting for inflation increased by 56%. But teacher salaries in real terms only increased by 2%. So we're throwing more and more money into the system. And he also found that most of this money went towards staffing surges, increases in administrative bloat. For example, he noticed that in New Hampshire, student enrollment growth was only 4% over that period, but the teacher staffing increased by about 25%, whereas all other staff increased by about 89%. So this is going towards more jobs for adults in the system, not so much towards instruction and teacher salaries, which can benefit students within the public school system. I think the best solution is to fund the students directly, or what most people call school choice. We already do this when it comes to higher education. St. Anselm College, for example, is a private religious university that accepts Pell Grants and the governor's scholarships, other forms of public funds that can be used at private universities. We already do this with pre-K programs. For example, the federal Head Start program, the funding doesn't go to a particular location that families are residentially assigned to if they want to use that funding. Instead, the funding rightly goes to individual families, and they can choose public or private, religious or non-religious pre-K providers of their choosing. We do the same thing when it comes to food stamps. We don't tell low-income families that they must use their public food stamp dollars at a residentially assigned government-run grocery store. And that would be absolutely ridiculous. I think everybody on this panel would agree that that would be an absurd thing to do. Instead, the better way is to allocate the funding to people and let them choose Walmart, Trader Joe's, Publix, Safeway. Instead of funding the institutions, we fund the people directly. And we should do the same thing with K-12 education. What's interesting to me is that the same people who support funding individuals directly when it comes to grocery stores and food stamps, or with higher education, with Pell Grants and the GI Bill, and with pre-K programs. They get all up in arms only when it comes to K-12 education. And the difference there is one of power dynamics. Choice is the norm with all of these other industries in the United States and with all these other levels of education, but choice threatens an entrenched special interest that profits from getting children's education dollars, regardless of how well they do, regardless of the choice of the family, regardless of the satisfaction of the family. And what we've seen over the past year, regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. So they fight really hard against families being able to take their children's education dollars to an alternative provider of the service. So we should apply the same logic with all of these other programs to K-12 education and fund students, fund people, as opposed to buildings and funding institutions. Someone earlier said that we shouldn't use public dollars to fund private institutions, but I wonder if other people who hold these views would support getting rid of food stamps and Pell Grants and the GI Bill and the Head Start program, Medicaid. Medicaid dollars can be used are public dollars that can be used at private religious hospitals. Is it a problem with public going to private, or is it a problem because their power dynamics differ only when it comes to K-12 education? I think we should just be logically consistent and apply the same logic, whether it comes to education, to groceries, to higher education, to pre-K, and apply that same logic to K-12 education and fund students. After all, education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution, public or private. The money doesn't belong to the public school. It doesn't belong to a charter school either. It doesn't belong to a private school either. Education funding belongs to the families, and it should follow their children to wherever they're getting an adequate education. So I think that's the best way to improve equity and competition at the same time. It gives the public schools a better incentive to do a better job, but then also it allows for more equity and opportunity in allowing more families to access educational alternatives. The reality is that the most advantaged in society already have school choice. They can already afford to live in neighborhoods that are residentially assigned to the best public schools. They're more likely to be able to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. They're more likely to be able to cover the cost of home-based education. We should equalize society by allowing more families to access these alternatives by funding students directly. We already spend in New Hampshire over $19,000 per student per year. Some of that funding, I would argue almost all of it, if not all of it, should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education, public or private. Thank you so much. I'm super excited to get into the moderated discussion and Q&A.
All right, awesome, Corey. Thank you. And everybody can unmute now and we'll just start talking. And Corey, I'm glad you mentioned money, because Dianna, I'll turn to you first. You know, how do we define equity? I mean, is it just about money? Is that it? Is that the only way that we measure equity?
I think that's a really great question. Definitely not. I mean, it's not just about school funding. And I was interested when Corey was talking, I really appreciate some of the things that he was talking about, the New Hampshire funding system, the $19,000 a year per pupil expenditure, just for the sake of the audience, per pupil expenditure. It's just the amount that the average district spends per pupil in their district. 19,000, yeah, that sounds about right. I think Corey's dead on. It's higher than almost all, or maybe even all states across the nation. We invest a lot of money, but the inequities are not about just funding, though, like I said at the beginning, it's a big part of it, but it's not just that. So it's a lot about, too, decision making and, you know, can we rely on parents to take that $19,000 and say, this teaching method is better for my child than this teaching method. This is going to yield durable learning. This might not. I have a special needs student. What's the highest impact kind of district for me to bring that child? You know, a lot of times where we make choices about where to spend money on food, I make bad choices because I'm not a nutritionist. So I think that money is a big part of it, a huge part of it. But it's really not the only thing.
What is the rest of it then? What else would be, you know, contributing to inequity, Dianna, if not quote unquote just money?
Well, a big part of it is to do with parent education, location. Tim has talked about, you know, location relative to high quality school districts. teachers who are supported in terms of professional development, in terms of preparing rigorous curriculum and lesson planning that's aligned, in terms of what you do in kindergarten versus first grade versus second grade. So you're not repeating the same content, but you're actually driving in the skills and content that kids can learn developmentally, what sticks. All of those things are things that experts in education go to school for many years and pay a lot of money, speaking of money, to learn how to do. So as a parent, if I were not an education expert, didn't have my PhD in curriculum assessment, I wouldn't really know what the features of public schooling are that will generate durable learning. But so I think that that's something that is a source of inequities and is something that as a system, the state of New Hampshire is responsible for providing for all of the kids.
Wow, so really interesting. And Corinne, I want to hear from you too. We have heard this before, and you do wonder, is it just about money? Is there something else that also drives the inequities that we all see in public education and between those schools that, Tim so aptly described in Los Angeles? So go ahead, Corinne, please.
Mm-hmm. Well, just getting back, yes, I mean, what resonates with me is accountability. Growing up, my own parents had school choice when it was time for me to go to school, and they made the choice to send me to private school. So school choice to me is not a new phenomenon. What it is how is it paid and where do the dollars come from? And I know homeschoolers have been very successful. I've had students and families who've been to private school, very successful. But I'm always looking at that underdog student that is disengaged, the student who stops going to school, the student who puts in a letter for they're going to homeschool because the parent is done fighting with them and they don't get out of bed in the morning. So to me, if there was accountability that was identical to what public school teachers and districts and systems need to provide, because we're spending taxpayer dollars, so you need accountability, then we would have assurance as to who's getting a good education, no matter where they get it. So that was my whole big thing. I got very upset when there was more legislation on homeschooling because I wasn't worried about those families or parents who were testifying, in support of homeschooling, because if they're testifying and they're there, they're good homeschool parents. I was really speaking on the premise of the number of kids that I had experience with that were just totally disengaged and, just checked out. And there was no mechanism to be able to re-engage those students or to really put pressure or accountability on the parents. So that's the group that concerns me.
Let's say that, Bill Gates or some other big money person came to you in Berlin and said, Corinne, money's no object. What do you need? And you had all the money. I mean, would it make a difference? How much of a difference would it make in terms of educational inequity?
Well, I can't speak for all the communities, but definitely personnel to be able to provide outreach services to families. I mean, we lacked in that. And, parents sometimes don't know what options they have, even if their student is enrolled in public school. They need to have the conversation that there are options for those kids. And maybe it's a non-traditional program. Maybe it's another school that's completely not in the public sector, but it has to go with accountability.
Yeah, and that's something we should get into, right? The home situation that some students bring to school with them. But before that, Tim, we've had this conversation in New Hampshire for a long time. School choice works in some areas like Nashua, one of our biggest cities, but in Berlin, where Corinne was superintendent, there's just not enough students to create school choice. There's just not enough population density. So how would you create sort of innovation or school choice and reduce inequity in a rural area where there's just not enough people to create, a system of school choice?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. Like, you never know what things will crop up, right? At the local level. And I think one of the things, I'm not a huge fan of the online schooling. right? I had a kindergartner in a Los Angeles Unified School District kindergarten who was, doing Zoom school every day, and not a huge fan of that. But that said, there are models of online schooling that can work, right? And for students like that who are remote, right? Just like a person who's who lives in the rural United States, perhaps 100 years ago, they're not going to be able to hear, right, the best music in the world. Now we have technologies where the best music in the world is available to everyone, right? And there are forms of education that work online, and those are going to be particularly valuable in places with fewer people, right? And this question about choice, you as a society, we have sort of a fork in the road. We can either assign children to schools, right? Or we can give parents and families choice. And there is no other way to do it. And the assigning children to school, like assigning children to schools, that just sounds very Soviet. And the reason it sounds very Soviet is because it is very Soviet, right? That doesn't, the government, whoever assigns your child to a school doesn't know that your kid loves to dance, or that she struggles with emotional regulation, right? Or that he's really good at math, right? The person who assigns your child to a school doesn't know your child at all, right? And one thing I fear about these policies of allocating schools based on where people live is that it encourages a certain degree of complacency. And I think it does that up and down the income spectrum. I don't think it's good for rich people. I don't think it's good for poor people. I don't think it's good for middle class people. I think it causes a lot of problems. So many people pick schools in this country for their children just because they're like, well, people like me live in that neighborhood. I'm going to move up there. I'm going to send my kids to whatever school is there. And I don't, I think it has led to complacency for parents. And these policies also impact parents up and down the economic spectrum. Like, I talked to a middle income family, for example, that had to sell their home because they bought a premium home in one of these privileged zones, one of these privileged districts with high achievement, because everyone else was doing it. Then they realized, wait, this isn't a good fit for our kids. They had to sell the home where they raised their daughters and move 2 miles down the street, right? I talked to another family in Malibu, right? Malibu is one of the wealthiest areas of Los Angeles, where one of my friend's mothers admitted to me, yeah, we didn't think the Malibu schools were right for our kids, so we purchased our neighbor's gas bill to get the kid into Santa Monica High School, right? Like, there are people lying about their addresses up and down the economic spectrum. Like, I couldn't believe the people who came out of the woodwork to talk about lying about their address up and down the economic spectrum when I was writing this book. And then you've got districts hiring private investigators to follow kids home from school to make sure that they're going to the school that they were told to by the government. There is nothing more Eastern, kind of Soviet era Eastern European than that, right? You get tip lines like, call in if your kid has a play date with one of their classmates and it's not in your neighborhood, make sure to call this tip line and turn them in. That is just ugly.
So
Anyway.
Tim, and I want to go back to Corey in a second. So how do you what's the solution? Like, we've been talking about this $19,000, per student. Is the answer to give every single parent $19,000 per kid and let them make a choice?
Well, I certainly think that goes a long way towards solving some of these problems and empowering parents so that the system doesn't have the power. We have another way of allocating seats in public schools when they're scarce, and that is lotteries. Charter schools across the United States are required by state laws to hold lotteries when more kids apply than they have seats for. And at the very least, I think all public schools should have to do that, right? You shouldn't be able to cherry, the reason that the reason those charter schools charter school laws were written like that is because they didn't want the charter schools cherry picking their kids, right? But we let traditional public schools cherry pick their kids using wealth and real estate as the proxy, right? If we shifted to a lottery-based system, I think you'd see some of these funding inequities go away pretty quickly, because right now you can lock yourself into one of these high spending schools by buying a house. If you couldn't lock yourself in, then you'd no longer vote for those funding inequities, right? And so I think getting the dollars attached to the kid and requiring true public schools to be available and open to the public via a lottery, I think it would go a long way.
Sure. So Corey, I want to bring you back in, both just your thoughts on what you heard from the other panelists, and also just how would this system of improvement work? Would it basically give, me a check for $19,000? I have 2 kids, so I can't do the math on the fly, but 38, thank you. So, would I get 38,000 and my next door neighbor would get 38,000 because she has 2 kids? Like, is that how it would work? And then sort of what devolves from there, Corey?
Yeah, I think the education savings accounts, or education freedom accounts, as they're called in New Hampshire, is the best way to go forward. And a high amount, like close to what would have been spent in the public schools, near $19,000, would be the best way to do it, in my view. And this would kind of help with the problem you addressed to Tim DeRoche about rural areas, because with the traditional voucher type of program, that can only be used for private school tuition and fees in most states. But with education freedom accounts, you can use the funding for non-brick and mortar type of school scenarios, so that you would be able to access more options like pandemic pods and micro schools, which don't require the same amount of capital investments as a brick and mortar private school. But I think Tim was also right that just because your area may not have a lot of private schools right now, if everybody had the funding tied to the student, you'd have a much different outlook of types of schools that exist. Maybe they're smaller schools, and maybe they're a mix of brick and mortar versus these pandemic pod types of arrangements. But I think the options would be there. And then look, the worst case scenario that's being imagined with the question of the rural area is that there's no change. If there aren't as many choices in rural areas, then you might not have as much movement. But I expect, as Tim said earlier, that there would be different alternatives available. I wanted to hit something else someone said about accountability. Let's face it, private schools and charter schools face the strongest form of accountability there is, which is accountability to their customers, accountability to families. If the school does a bad job, families can take their children's education dollars elsewhere and vote with their feet. So they have a strong bottom-up set of incentives, a form of accountability to do the right thing for their families. The way that I've put it millions of times before is that underperforming private schools shut down, underperforming district schools get more money. The set of incentives is completely backwards in the traditional system, because they can always go back to the voter and back to the government and say, we're failing because we need more money. But in the charter and private school sector in general, if they do a bad job and people vote with their feet away, their schools must shut down. And so they have to shape up and improve. And with school choice, this leads to improvements in the public school sector as well, because that set of incentives changes. In fact, there are 28 studies nationwide that look at the effects of private school choice competition on the students who remained in the public school system. 26 of the 28 studies find positive effects on student outcomes from school choice competition in the public school system. So school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats because of that competitive pressure as well. That's mostly what I wanted to hit on. And yeah, I talked a little bit about the education freedom accounts. One other thing that was said earlier was about the NAEP rankings in New Hampshire. They're not at the top if you control for student demographic characteristics. I'll put it into the chat in a second, but the Urban Institute has something called America's Gradebook. And they took the 2019 latest NAEP results from the nation's report card. And after controlling for free and reduced lunch students and different background characteristics of the students, New Hampshire is actually in the bottom half of states on 8th grade math and reading outcomes. But I don't think the argument for school choice really, it's not really tied to how the public schools are doing. If the public school is doing a good job, they won't lose a lot of students, and families should still be able to pick the public schools no matter how they're ranked nationally. So I also want to be clear that in the proposal to fund students directly, the public school should absolutely still be an option that's on the table, but people shouldn't be forced, as Tim said, into a particular institution regardless of their choice. And let's face it, the least advantaged are the ones that are most likely to be stuck because of these government lines that are drawn. And the most advantaged are the ones that are more likely to be able to move houses or to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. I would like for more families to be able to access these alternatives.
Wow. And, you know, Tim told us some of those amazing stories about moving houses and lying on your electric bill. And that is, that's pretty shocking. Dianna, we're going to turn to our audience pretty soon and gather some questions there. But what do you think, Dianna? Is there some common ground among what we're hearing from all of our panelists today, including you?
Yeah, I think that there's very clear common ground in the fact that public schools should provide some equality in term or equity and opportunity for students, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their parent income. I think we all share the same concern about the fundamental problem here. I very much disagree with some of the proposals here that are being put forward. And I think, and it may be because of my sort of local knowledge of what's going on in New England. I'm very much a Yankee. Like, I grew up in New England. I've lived in 4 out of 6 New England states. I taught high school in Greenwich, Connecticut. Yes, Greenwich, Connecticut. I don't think that New Hampshire parents are complacent. I think that they choose communities where they feel an alignment and affinity with the people in those communities. In many cases in New Hampshire, people are in communities that they've been in generationally. This is the case on the west side of Manchester, where families have been in West Manch for generations. My question is, how is it that $19,000 is going to help a family in West Manch pay for a private school education at Derryfield? It's not going to. So for any of you who aren't aware of Derryfield's tuition, and I think that the same was the case in Greenwich. We had a lot of students that would come across the border from Port Chester, New York, and fake their residency for Greenwich. And I think that it's not fair. It was not fair for those children. I do not blame those parents at all for doing pulling those kinds of shenanigans to get their kids high quality public education. The reality is, if they don't have a neighborhood public school that will be a high quality public school for them, I don't fault any parent for doing what they can to get access to those high quality public schooling scenarios. And the reality in New Hampshire is that we have 29 charter schools that are publicly funded, and they aren't in the same locations as the schools and districts that are in the highest need. So we're basically, if we want to go for this voucher, I've heard it described as opponents call them vouchers. Yes, I call them vouchers. Vouchers for $19,000 to go wherever they want to go. They have to be within a drivable distance of a private school or a charter school, which is often not the case. And often they may not have a working car. So, I mean, those are not realistic solutions for public school in New Hampshire. We need high quality neighborhood schools that are supported by our state. And I think that's
questions coming in from our audience, which is awesome. And here's one from Janice, who is for you, Corey. Janice says, I've oftentimes considered the value of putting funds directly in the hands of individuals, in this case for parents to shop and choose an educational system for their children, much like other government programs such as food stamps, Medicaid, etc. My question is, what public goods and services are appropriate for this type of model and which are not, and based on what factors? For example, should parents have to buy their own national security and defense, pay to ensure safe food and drugs, pay to have a piece of a highway paved, or offset farming losses in the Midwest? Why is it appropriate to choose this method for education, but not other mass public goods and services? Janice, thank you for writing. So Corey, it's kind of a different framing. You know, Janice seems to be saying it's not really the same as groceries. It's like more like a public good, like national defense and roads. So
it's not like national defense.
Yeah.
The short answer is it's not like national defense. It's not a true public good because you can exclude non-payers. You already have that in the current traditional public school system. And we already have private schools that exist. You don't have to imagine how things would work if you had a voucher to attend a private school. We already have these things working on the ground in practice, whereas we don't have competing national defense agencies. That's not something that we have. And so it's not really hard to imagine how this would work with K-12 education. One, because it's not a public good. It's rivalrous and excludable in consumption when you look at the definition of a public good. It fails both conditions, and that's as evidenced by the fact that we have private schools that exist today and other private forms of education. So this isn't really hard to figure out why we should do it this way. Just like with groceries, we have different providers of grocery store services. We have different providers of education at the higher education level. St. Anselm accepts Pell Grant recipients using taxpayer funding to attend a private religious university. We should just apply the same logic with higher education and every other industry essentially to K-12 education. Same thing with pre-K as well. I just wanted to point out, Dianna had mentioned that, $19,000 might not be enough, but look, private school tuition on average in New Hampshire is about $19,000 per student per year. If you look at Private School Review's website, which I posted in the chat, and even if, let's say the average was, 21,000 or something, it was a little higher than the voucher amount. Would you not support Pell Grants just because they don't cover the full cost of tuition at Harvard? No, everybody understands that any little bit helps, and some assistance is better than no assistance at all. Similarly, would you not support food stamps if they didn't come with a car to drive you to the grocery store? No, because everybody understands that helping people some part of the way is better than not helping them at all. So I think, again, we should apply the same logic to K through 12.
Well, and setting aside the grocery store analogy, I appreciate your analogy, Corey, about the university system, higher education. So what about that, Corrine? Could we apply this approach that we take with higher education, where some students get assistance? We have a public system and a private system. Could we apply that to our K through 12 education? Would that be helpful?
I'd have to do a lot of thinking about that. Again, I'm concerned about, it's not the issue of parents having the choice to send their children where they want them to be educated. It's what are the accountability measures or the guidelines for admittance? I mean, if private schools or religious schools admit everybody and anybody like a public school, now you have all public schools. But it depends on the rules. Some have different rules, and I'm speaking really from northern New Hampshire and New Hampshire as a state, how we are organized in our public school systems, how our charter schools are, and we have multiple private schools, some religious, some not religious. You have to think about the public. Our funding system is based on the local property taxpayer. Do I want to pay somebody to go and have a private school education? And then how do I compare that in terms of the accountability of what the end product looks like compared to what requirements are in place for public education? So, there needs to be an awful lot of work done to be able to hold everybody to the same high standard. Be able to, make that work.
We have another question from our audience. Janet, by the way, thank you for joining in. This is from Ray, who says, why don't we bring the good schools to the neighborhoods instead of making families scramble to ship their kids across town, especially when more affluent families have time and money available? Now, that's a good one for you, Tim, because again, you've talked a lot about this sort of location-based system. So again, Ray says, why don't we bring the good schools to the neighborhoods instead of making families scramble to ship their kids across town? So go ahead, Tim, please.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. We've been increasing funding for inner city schools for a long, long time, right? Or some of the rural areas, right? Where there is no clear way, right? To increase the quality of schools in a given neighborhood, right? There is no, and I think some of Corey's points around incentives matter for that, right? In those inner city areas, there is a captive audience, right? In low income areas, there is a captive audience of kids that can't go anywhere else, that can't choose another school, whose parents can't get them across town because they're working 2 jobs, or maybe they're a single mom or a single dad. So it is not easy to do that. And you know, another thing that I hear a lot is, well, let's, and I saw it in one of the chat, you know, why are we talking about elite versus non-elite public schools? Like, why can't we just make all schools good? And I don't think that's possible, right? In the purest sense, because if we overnight, if you could wave a magic wand and say all schools will be funded exactly equally, and all schools will have the same levels of achievement, fortunately or unfortunately, or maybe both, where you send your schools to kid is wrapped up in your social status, right? And people, you know, René Girard, the French philosopher, you know, talks about human desire being mimetic. We want what other people want. There will always be schools that are fashionable, that have more demand, where everyone wants to send their kids, even if they have the exact same test scores, even if they have the exact same experience level of teachers, the same funding. Those might be for good reasons. They might be for bad reasons. It might be for culture. It might be for fit for your kid. It might be because you just want to be where the cool kids are. You just want, you know, you want to send your kids where the people you admire send their kids. And we can't avoid that. And any society that wants to run public schools through the government has to have a mechanism of saying who is going to get into these schools that have excess demand and not enough seats. We need a way to do that. And we've sort of shoveled it under the carpet, and we've said, we're going to do it by geography. And we're going to tell ourselves that it's because every kid needs a public school, like a local public school, and every family needs a neighborhood public school. We haven't thought fully about the implications of that and how damaging it is to the social compact over time, how it exacerbates the social divisions in our country over time, because you start with some degree of income segregation. Then you draw this line, and then the wealthy people try to move in, they drive up the prices. It increases racial and economic segregation in our country. And I think it's one of the root causes of our current discontent more broadly, that the public education system is not giving everyone control over their own destiny and an equal shot at the American dream.
So where is, and maybe I'll throw this to everybody, Corey, I'll start with you. And Dianna, I sort of asked you a little bit before, but I'm going to flip back to it as well. You know, lots of ideas here, lots of concerns. Everybody wants what's best for the kids, obviously, because that helps them and it helps America. So where is there, Corey, I'll start with you. Where is there common ground on some of the themes that we're raising today?
We didn't talk much about funding formulas, but I could probably agree with others that, you know, if you can introduce different weights into the funding formula to make it more equitable, if you could make the state percentage of the total higher than what it is currently now in New Hampshire, I think we could agree on those things. We didn't touch on it as much, but, you know, if I think any of these changes to the funding formula, no matter what we do with the public school system, that funding should be reallocated and follow the child instead of the institution. So we could have 100% of the funding at the state level, and I think that would be okay. But that funding, all of it should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education: the public school, private school, charter school, homeschool. And just to clarify earlier, when we talked about how this would work in practice, it wouldn't just be $19,000 cash going to the family where they can spend it on whatever they want. Any government approved education expenditure, including private school tuition and fees or curriculums or other instructional materials. Just to be clear on that, so people don't think that you could just spend the money on going out to eat or other frivolous.
It gets the accountability piece that Corinne has brought up. So thank you, Corey. That's great. Corinne, how about you? I mean, you know, lots of ideas, and I feel like we barely have time to scratch the surface, but where is the common ground? I mean, you know, while the adults are, you know, debating all this, the kids, you know, they need the best.
Well, the common ground obviously are the students and the kids. I mean, our resources and our focus needs to be on how can we educate all our students in the state of New Hampshire? And how can they all have the opportunities for the same type of potential for outcomes? I mean, those are big, big ifs. Because of the fact that the school funding is based on property wealth, that's where the inequities are. And it creates such a tax burden so that, as I'd mentioned, those towns that run, I mean, I pay a $39 plus per thousand on a tax rate because the city has between 32 and 35% of taxable property. And over 65% of the town is state and federal prisons and state and federal buildings and national forest lands. So then you translate that, what capacity there is to raise revenue to pay for schools, whether they're public or anything else, compare it to a seacoast or a lakes region school district that has multi-million-dollar homes and lots of economy and industry. The North Country is just not on that playing field.
Yeah, I live in Concord and we have a lot of state government buildings here too. So I hear you
Right.
on the available tax base. So common ground with this idea of school choice, Corinne, or some of the other themes that you're hearing the other panelists make? Is there a way to, I don't want to say meet in the middle, but pull some of the best ideas out there for the common goal of improving schools for our kids?
Right. Well, again, I go back. I mean, parents have always had school choice for wherever they live, and they can make that choice. Private schools that I'm aware of have scholarships for those who can't afford it. Now, does it leave some people out? I'm sure it does. I know public schools have increased their opportunities to offer alternatives, but for me, it gets down to what's that teacher quality in non-public schools, because the accountability for teacher quality in public schools is key to the success of a student. And so again, I go back to accountability. What are the requirements? What is the curriculum? Is it as rigorous? It is not as rigorous. Where's that bench line? Is that student at the end of a program, no matter where they've gone, are they workforce ready or college and career ready? In that sense, because now public schools also need to measure college and career readiness of students once they become freshmen and sophomores. So to me, it's wherever those kids can meet all those same guidelines, jump through those hoops, and then scaffold whatever services they need. Right now, the public school is what is granting all of that.
Tim, I'm going to open it up to you too and give you a chance to sort of, we've fleshed out so many themes. Where can we find sort of common ground for this common goal?
Sorry, was that to me? I missed the first. Oh,
yes,
thanks.
Tim. Yeah.
Yeah, I think probably everyone on this call agrees that public education is not currently, the K-12 system of education is not currently playing the role that was envisioned for it by the founders of the Common School movement, right? I mean, the Horace Mann called education the great equalizer, right? I think we've got a common sense on this panel that it is not providing that function. And in many ways, you could say that the public education, the K-12 education system in this country is doing more to reinforce and exacerbate the divisions in our country rather than combating them. And I think that's been a slow erosion over time. I think that too many people see the public system as a captive group of folks, right? A captive system. And for someone who's a liberal like me, this is an embarrassing issue. Because when you look up on the hill, the elite public school in my neighborhood, right, that has this elite zone, this zone around it, it's the only school in the neighborhood that has more than 9% white students. And it's got over 60% white students. It's the only school in the neighborhood that has over 75% reading proficiency, and all the other schools are below 50. And who are the people who live there? If you walk up in that neighborhood, they all have BLM signs out front. And when I talk to those parents, they get very angry at me and they say, well, all of my neighbors would take their kids out of these schools if the school was opened up to the people who live blocks away. That is a national embarrassment, and we should not be allowing that to happen. We should not be, and I know what's going on. The teachers unions, for example, are all about equity, but they have been silent on this issue. I haven't been able to get a single person from a teachers union to talk to me about these zone lines. And I think I know what's going on. They believe it's critical to holding their political coalition together to allocate seats in those elite schools to politically powerful Democratic leaning constituencies. And, you know, my wife lets me peer over her shoulder on the moms group sometimes. The same people who spent $200,000 to live in these elite zones are the same people who are shaming other parents for choosing a charter school, for trying to find a magnet school for their kid. I don't want to shame any parent for what they do, like buying a home in a near a good school, or lying about your address, or choosing a private school. I don't want to shame any parent. But I do want to shame parents who use their wealth to buy into a public school and then shame other people for trying to find a good option. I don't think it's morally right, and I think it's embarrassing for people like me of the left that this goes on.
So here's a question from a state representative, Sue Homala, who says, thank you for having this discussion. I want to address a comment a panelist made concerning parents not having the expertise to understand their child's academic needs. To be honest, I find this insulting to parents. It's an example of bias which prohibits solutions from being implemented. Thank you, Representative, for writing in. And Dianna, was that you who said, and I think you were misinterpreted there. I think you were, yeah, go ahead. I want to give you a chance to kind of clear that up.
No, I think so too. I'm along the lines with Tim in terms of not wanting to shame any parents. That was not at all the intention of what I was saying. What I was saying is that when people do have choice and they do make choices about where they want to spend their money, if they have a voucher or a school fund, or they want to, you know, apply to a charter school or bus their children around, or like Tim is talking about, live up on the hill and then have the BLM sign in your neighborhood. They can make those choices, and they make those choices, every one of them make those choices with the best interests of their children at heart. What I did say was, I don't believe that parents in New Hampshire are complacent about their children's education. I don't believe that parents in New Hampshire don't care about where their kids go to school. What I do think is that the market model, that logic doesn't really work when it comes to public goods, because we just don't have equal access geographically to these communities. And I think, to these schools. And I do think that, you know, like, okay, so $19,000, yeah, that will go some way in terms of paying for a private Catholic school. Dairyfield, not so much, you know, it's probably 40K. And so, yeah, that's some of the way. I hear Corey saying, well, that's some of the way to the private school tuition, but only a small subset of parents are going to choose that. Then they're taking on a whole bunch of debt. And if we want to talk about who's bearing unequal burdens in terms of student debt in this country, that's a whole other hour and a half. That's a problem as well. But I really think that one of the things that's missing from this conversation about inequity is that parents in New Hampshire are unlike the Soviet Union. They're choosing to live in their communities. They're making those choices. They are making the choices to identify with those communities. And we're not paying attention to how children learn from their community, from their neighborhood. If they're in a situation where they feel like, I need to get on a bus for an hour and 15 minutes and go someplace else to be schooled, they are learning a lesson there. They're learning a lesson about my community's local neighborhood school is not important enough for this state to fund it in an equitable manner. I have to get on a bus and drive an hour and 15 minutes away.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned, yeah, state funding, because this last audience question is from Elizabeth, who says, it seems to me that with all of these options under discussion, the lack of state support for education remains the sticking point. Even school choice only works if school funding comes predominantly from the state and is not so reliant on property taxes. So Coy, I'm going to throw that to you. So if we did do this, you know, $19,000, every parent gets it. I guess that would have to come from state taxpayers. That would be, and I'm not
You
saying
could,
it's a
you
bad
could,
idea, but boy, you here in New Hampshire, I can picture lawmakers saying, no way, I'm not going to raise taxes that much. So where would that money come from? Yeah.
I mean, you could just reallocate the funding that would have went through the local property tax system to the public school and have that follow the child instead. So another way to do it is to wrap all funding up to the state level to make it simpler. So you could have 100% as funding, or 90 if you include the federal funding, tied at the state level rather than the local level, and then more funding could follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. So that's a couple of ways that you could do it. I just want to point out real quick, again, we shouldn't use examples of $44,000 tuition when the average tuition in the state is $19,000 per student per year. And just a little earlier, someone mentioned the accountability again, and how the teachers are maybe not as good in the private schools, or maybe they have less certifications or something along the lines that was said. But if that's the case, then why would families choose those schools when given the option? I've never said that the public school shouldn't be an option that remains on the table. I think that absolutely should be an option. But if it's true that the private schools aren't accountable and that they're doing such a bad job and that they're, not actually great schools, then I don't see what the traditional system has to worry about then by giving families an option. I think they are I think the reality is they are accountable directly they're directly accountable to the families.
We did have an audience member point out that one of the reasons for that average cost, and Diana's right, Dairyfield, which is one of our top, private day schools, is about 36,000. The reason that average is 19,000 is there are a lot of Catholic schools in New Hampshire, and those tend to lower the cost. But I understand your point, Corey, that if the schools were terrible, parents wouldn't pay to send their kids there. Boy, I'd love to go to more audience questions, but I'm very mindful of the time, and I'm wondering if we can just do this again in 6 months. But being mindful of the time, I do want to turn it back to my wonderful colleague, Max Latona. So Max, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and thank you to all of the panelists for your insight. I guess I have now more questions at the end of this than I came with, which really I think is a testament to the insight, the complexity, the different difficult questions that this issue bears upon. So thank you to all of the panelists for your great insight. I think there's a lot of difference of opinion, and that's healthy. But there was some common ground. I think everybody agreed on the importance of accountability in one way or another, on taking care of the least fortunate among our children in New Hampshire, that they deserve a good education. And I think there seems to be a common sort of sentiment that the property tax system is not the way to fund education. It produces these inequities that we're seeing. At any rate, I do, again, Laura, want to thank you for doing an exceptional job moderating a very complex issue with wonderful perspective from a variety of different panelists. So thank you for that. To the audience, I want to thank all of you for attending today. We are committed as a center to following up on this issue, to a sustained engagement with this, along with other partners in the state who are also addressing this issue. And to keep an eye on other programs that we have coming up, please visit our website, ethics.anselm.edu. And I want to thank you again for a wonderful discussion, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. So good evening to everybody. Yeah, thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us, Max.
Bye, Diana.